want to talk about something today which has been bothering me for many years, although I'm sure many people will realize what I'm saying is a commonplace and they'll already understand it, but I think it should be said anyway. When we have discussions about music, whatever that may mean, and it's a very complicated subject with many different genres and forms and modes and periods. But when we talk about music, we often hear people say, I like good music, which is a good idea because it's like probably good to like the good of anything that you could possibly pursue. I like good music, and there's a class of these music listeners, music aficionados. By good music, they mean classical music, which means symphonic music, four-piece music, and choral music, and other elaborate forms of music of the 18th and 19th century. Sometimes the 17th, but usually 18th and 19th century. What they mean is their ideal of fine music begins in the tradition of Bach and his contemporaries, but especially has momentum with Haydn and Mozart down to Beethoven and ending with the period of Mahler, let's say. And everybody knows, I think, that these people produced stupendous works of art, sublime creations of the imagination. And I suppose anybody who's heard the third and the fifth and the ninth of Beethoven will realize that there's not much farther the human imagination could go in the sonata form or the large orchestral arrangement of symphonic music. That this is one of the great creations of the human imagination in all of history, and that it happened in the 18th and 19th century. This was a long and grand development of possibilities in culture, and it is a unique achievement. And I'm not here to say anything derogatory or negative about this great achievement of European and especially German music. It may in fact be the greatest artistic achievement of that long period in European culture, meaning it's greater, say, than even the great poets of the same era, whether we talk about Pope in the 18th century or Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Tennyson, or in Germany, Heine and Goethe and Rilke, whoever we want to talk about in the whole period from the 18th century to modernism. I suppose it's fair to say, if you wanted to make a really fair assessment, that the great works of the composers of symphonies and other large-scale compositions of music in that period were the greatest achievements in art. And that includes, I think, painting, poetry, architecture, and what other modes of art that one could conceive. And so I concede right at the beginning that there was a remarkable and original achievement in this way. But for a person who's an aficionado, an admirer, a student of Bach, of Haydn, of Mozart, of Beethoven, of Bruckner, of Mahler or Stravinsky, to say, well, this is a much greater achievement than a song by the Beatles or by Gershwin or any kind of popular tune, Hank Williams or Aznavour in French or something. This is so obvious and almost pointless. It has the same kind of significance as saying, I prefer Paradise Lost to a sonnet by Keats. I think it's a greater achievement. But the problem with that kind of reasoning is that the fact that Paradise Lost or Hamlet is a greater achievement than a sonnet by Keats or Wordsworth tells us nothing about the value of the sonnet of Keats and Wordsworth. It doesn't tell us that among sonnets, of which there are thousands and thousands in English language, those are the finest, along with Shakespeare and Frost and a few other people you could name, that in this giant family of 14-line lyric poems, which is one of the clever inventions of European literature, that these few English writers, and they have counterparts in Italy and France and elsewhere, they have done the sonnet with such perfection that the poems they have done are memorable of permanent interest, entertaining, perfectly realized and executed, and the perfection of a form, which is a shared part of the culture, it really means nothing to say that an epic poem, which we grant immediately, has a greater scope, is more difficult to create, has greater moral weight, et cetera, et cetera. This we accept, but it really tells us nothing about the sonnet. It's not a way of organizing our thoughts about sonnets to say that they're not equal to epics. Now, if one, for some reason, wanted to make a hierarchy of genres for some kind of aesthetic moral purpose, I guess you could say the epic is the greatest achievement in words of the European tradition, and you could go down to tragedy or comedy, and you could say the lyric poem. But this is a very difficult thing to argue or produce. There are many, since Thomas Gray's time, people would say the lyric poem is the most important element in the tradition, and this is a very difficult and arcane argument, which I'm not going to enter into today. But the reason I mention this today is, what could be more crazy, more irrelevant, than to say that a Beatles song, just to take a classic example because it's been said so many times, are not equal to the pieces, to the greatest works of Bach or Beethoven or Mahler? What does it mean to say this when these two works of art have nothing in common? And let me explain what I mean by that. If we go back to antiquity, the word musicae, from which we derive etymologically the word music in English, the word musicae always meant song with words. It never meant what we think of as orchestral music or simply music as an end in itself without any verbal expression. Musicae meant setting words with a stringed instrument, generally speaking. And even in the remotest antiquity, there was the single artist who played a stringed instrument of some kind. There were several different in antiquity, and sang or chanted a poem. This is something so pervasive that it exists in every single European language culture, whether in Scandinavia or in Eastern Europe or in France or in Italy or even in America. There's no exception. Every Western culture, and this is probably true in Asia as well, has this body of lyrics that were played with stringed instruments or some other accompaniment, and were relatively short poems that make it usually a personal and a subjective statement. This is a tradition that's universal. It's found in every folk tradition, and it also has a sophisticated, artful tradition in every one of these language cultures. It's one of the most prevalent parts of the entire inheritance of art. Now, if we wanted to compare the Beatles with Sappho, you could almost say that that's a reasonable comparison. Sappho's writing a moderately short lyric, usually on a erotic or amorous topic. She has a very ingenious metrical or rhythmic arrangement of her words, perhaps on a level higher than the Beatles. But whether the overall complexity of a Sappho poem and the suggestiveness of it is more complex than the Beatles, and that's actually a very open and difficult question, and one that is not as immediately obvious as somebody might think who hasn't actually read both of them or thought about both of those. In any event, they're connected to each other historically by subject matter, by size, and by the fact that Sappho was also set to music in her own contemporary cultural moment, either with a choir of female vocalists or with a single musician. In any event, my point today is very simple. When somebody says the Beatles or Elton John or Gershwin or Cole Porter or Irving Berlin are not equal to Bach and Beethoven and Mahler, that may be true simply because of the fantastically complex scale and kind of athletic architecture of those long musical pieces. But it tells you nothing about the inherent excellence of this shorter mode of lyrical presentation that we see in popular music. Actually, the great popular musicians and composers of the 1960s and 70s, and I would include within those Lennon, McCartney, Neil Young, Paul Simon, John Fogerty, Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, and one could name numerous others. They're important, perhaps smaller. They actually comprise an important historical moment in American and in Western art. And what I mean by that is, as book poetry, lyric poetry written in books, declined, and it rapidly declined after World War II, it became professionalized, it became academicized. Now there was a poet in residence at every college, and they wrote often very flaccid, boring, pointless poems in order to get tenure, which is not the normal motive for a poet to excel in the highest degree. And this culture of the workshop, as we call it, of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, slowly declined from the age of Robert Lowell, where there was still great book poetry being written, to this period of flattening on the level. Now, there are very fine poets in the last 30 or 40 years. I think of Wright or Tomlinson or Heaney and many, many others. I don't want to shortchange any artists of the recent past who have written book poetry on a high level, and there are people that, but on the whole, this is my point, as book poetry, the poetry we read in anthologies and in collections of individual artists, has declined since World War II, since the great modernist works, a period of Eliot and Pound and the later Yeats. Since that decline, which has been precipitous, these poems set to music, set to a stringed instrument, usually guitar or the four-piece bands we're all familiar with in rock and roll or pop music, or in small orchestral arrangements in the earlier period. These kinds of songs, which harken back to a long tradition in the Renaissance, in the late Middle Ages, and in antiquity, of a single singer making a point about love or personal experience with a stringed instrument, this has now been revitalized and rejuvenated, so that the artists of the 1960s and 70s, far from being imperfect and irrelevant, they have really taken the place largely in the cultural imagination of the book poets of the earlier 20th century and the 19th century. And now suddenly this old tradition of lyric with stringed instrument, this very powerful mode of the 4 or 5 verse song played set very simply to music. And I emphasize that. They're often 3 or 4 or 5 chord songs. They're often well-selected and lucid words. They're often rhetorically direct and powerful, which is part of the art of the popular song. They are more rhetorical in some sense than they are musical. We know that they don't have the musical complexity of a piece by Mahler or Beethoven. It would be ridiculous to even think about that. They'd have no intention of doing anything like that. They're not striving for that. They're striving for an immediate effect of memorable, quotable, singable expressions of thought of great importance to the contemporary audience. In some cases in the 60s, they were political in nature, and often they are amorous or private in nature, but they fill a place on a high artistic level. And as my talks go on, I'm going to start talking about the artistry of some of these and how we should see them as part of the permanent and effective canon in the English language imagination. And that's a beginning point. So let's not make the mistake of comparing things so unlike that we learn nothing about them by the comparison.